I'm really excited about the presentation that we have today. We're very lucky to have Hal Hershfield speaking to us in this session. Hal's a professor of marketing and behavioral decision making and psychology at UCLA School of Management. Hal's research looks at how we can improve long-term decision making by connecting with our future self. And Hal actually has a new book out on this topic, Your Future Self and How to Make a Better Tomorrow. The book apparently is due out in Australia around middle of September, but I did happen to get a copy about a month ago. So without naming names, Booktopia seemed to have it available. So I'm very much looking forward to reading that one. Hal's published in many different academic journals and also in the Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. There was a great article in the New York Times actually on the weekend, which talked about some of Hal's work and why it is that we sign up to future events that we don't really want to do. This really resonated with me, and there was a great quote. It said, "I signed up for a fun run 3 months ago. Now the event is looming in my calendar, and I run through excuses of how to get out of it. I want to be the sort of person who runs for pleasure, but I'm not. Why did I say yes in the first place?" So I'm hoping that Hal is going to be able to give us some insights as to why we say yes to these events in the future, and when they come around, we wonder why we did so. Before we kick off and hand over to Hal to talk, there's just a few housekeeping bits and pieces. So one, Merle is going to be doing the Q&A facilitation. Hal will speak for about 25 minutes. So we've got plenty of time for lots of questions and discussion. If you can drop those into the chat as we go through, that would be fantastic. And also just to call out to UTS Plus Business Futures, who sponsors these meetups and enabled us to run them and host them and bring great speakers to you each month. We'll drop some information again into the chat and also on the meetup about UTS Plus Business Futures and how they support organisations with training and development. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Hal, and I'm really looking forward to this session. Thanks, Hal.
All right, thank you so much, Alison. I'm really honored to be invited to do this, and I'm happy to be here with you all. I know that many of you are coming in from all different time zones, so thank you for doing it. And I'm excited to talk about my research and the book that I just wrote, which is really sort of based on all this research. And I know all of you are sort of coming at this from the behavioral science lens, and my hope is to talk a little bit about the ideas that I share in the book, the ideas that have been my research, and then also to think sort of practically, but then leave plenty of time for questions. So one of the things that I wanted to start with was actually before we started, Merle was asking me sort of a little bit about writing the book. And one of the things that was really sort of surprising about it was the different people I got to talk to, right? So much of my work thus far has been, large surveys and large data sets, and we get less of a chance to talk to, individual people. And so one of the guys that I talked to was this guy named Greg, who was, he was an entrepreneur. This is back in the 1990s. He lived in the sort of Midwest of the US. But he was in his early 20s, and he decided he wanted to make like a big change in his life. And he moves west. He moves to San Francisco. And he starts working at this music club, and he's like a bouncer and an event planner and a bartender, like a jack of all trades. And he has one day off a week, and on each of those days he kind of explores San Francisco to see what some new neighborhoods are and whatnot. And one of these days he goes into this neighborhood in San Francisco called the Mission. There's like a lot of like little Mexican restaurants, like burrito spots. And he's walking around, and around this time in his life, he decided that he wanted to get a tattoo. And so he was in the market for a tattoo. He hadn't had one yet before. And so he walks by this one little restaurant. It's kind of like a little teeny like hole in the wall. And sorry, I just got a message that the volume is can you guys all hear me okay? All right. Okay. So he walks by this little hole in the wall, and there's this the restaurant logo, and it's a picture of like a little boy with a big floppy hat, and he's riding on a rocket ship made out of a corn cob. That's the restaurant's logo. and there's this sign next to it, and the sign says, "Tattoo me on your body and get free food for the rest of your life." Now, I like if I were to walk by that, and you can call me lame or square or whatever, I would have been like, sorry, no, like I'm too risk averse. But this guy Greg sees it and immediately is like, this is really clever. I think I want to get this tattoo. Now, of course, the first thing he does is goes into the restaurant to see if he wants this food for the rest of his life. He has a burrito and he's like, that was pretty good. I like it enough. The next day he gets this tattoo on his arm so he can get free food for the rest of his life. Now, this story became like a little bit of a news item in San Francisco. When I first heard about it, I was like, that feels like something that I personally would regret. It feels like a mistake. Now, and I want to be really clear. I know the data on tattoos. Most tattoos are not regrettable. There's like, I think like the majority of people do not regret tattoos unless it's the name of an ex-lover or if the image fades and morphs in shape over time. I don't need to go further with that. Okay. So I was really curious about this because in my mind, it represented, or it could represent, one of these mistakes we make with what we as researchers call intertemporal decisions, right? I think all of us sort of know this term, but if you don't, of course, the term means decisions that have consequences both now and later. In this particular case, I think it's a version of a mistake we make when we take our present self's interests and project them onto our future self, possibly in an unfair way, right? Not respecting the fact that our future self may have interests that differ from our present self. So in the work that I've done for the last probably 15 years or so, I've been trying to understand different versions of these types of mistakes. That is, these mistakes where our present selves and our future selves aren't necessarily fair to each other. The answer that I've been circling around has something not as much to do with the features of the decisions themselves, although I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but more about the way that we think of ourselves or our identity over time. Okay. And so what I mean by that is that when we think of who we are, if I were to ask you, are you the same as who you were when you were 8 years old or 9 years old? It's a little bit of a strange question. But what we mean by that is, have you changed or are you the same? And I think a lot of people, when the question is put to them, they would say, you know what, I'm pretty much the same. I mean, my name is the same and I have some of the same friends. And then you start to think about it on a deeper level and you might say all of a sudden, actually, that doesn't really capture reality. You may have moved, your name may have changed, your hair may have changed, your looks may change, your friends may change, your spouse may change, all these things may change. And so suddenly the idea that we are one self over time doesn't feel quite right. And so philosophers, Derek Parfit being one of the main ones, a British philosopher, and then many others, have suggested that maybe a better way to think of our identity over time is that rather than one single entity, we're really a collection of separate selves over time. And I think that sort of better captures who we are. Now, it's somewhat of a strange notion. And I'll tell you in a minute why I think this really matters for decision-making and for getting people to do more of the things that they say that they want to do. But the reality is that there's some really, I think, interesting data that backs up some of these ideas, the idea that we are separate selves over time. So Emily Pronin, who is a psychology professor at Princeton, she ran a study years ago where she asked undergrads to think about a meal or a birthday that was happening right now, right in front of them, and describe the scene. And people say, well, you know, there's friends there, there's birthday cake, I'm eating, whatever, sort of, you know, what you would normally say. And then she takes a different group of undergrads and she says, describe a meal or a birthday in the very distant future, which apparently, and there's data on this, the very distant future for undergrads is any time over the age of 40, which I found slightly depressing reading this, over the age of 40. Something really interesting happens. When you ask this other group to think about that same thing, a meal, a birthday, whatever it is in the distant future, people are more likely to use the third person perspective when describing their future self. So their future self is almost another person in the scene. They'll say some things like, he is with his friends, he is eating cake, whatever it may be. Now, I'm not saying like all of us may do that, but people are more likely to do that. My own early work has used neuroimaging to look at the same sort of question. And one of the things that I found, this was with my collaborators, Brian Knutson and Elliot Wimmer, we found that when you get people to think of their future selves, the activity in the brain that arises from those thoughts of a future self is more similar to the activity that arises when you get people to think about another person. So, what that means is that in the brain, on average, our future selves look like different people. Okay. Now, there's like a lot of other evidence to back up this point that our future selves may seem like different people. Those are just two of the points, and I'm happy to sort of elaborate on this later. But it brings up this really interesting idea, which is that there really can be these separations in selves over time. If that's still abstract, I'm really fond of quoting Jerry Seinfeld on this same idea. If any of you are Seinfeld fans, years ago, he came up with this really clever description of what happens when he stays up late at night. And he says, he says this line where he says, I stay up too late at night. That's not my problem. That's morning guy's problem. And he says, you set your alarm for the next morning. Who cares, right? Like I can stay up as late as I want watching whatever episode of Netflix or reading or whatever. And he says, morning guy wakes up and he's mad at night guy. And he's like, damn it, I can't believe he set the alarm and I'm frustrated and you're exhausted and you're groggy and you're cursing night guy. And so then he has this idea. He says, the only thing that morning guy can do is to try to oversleep often enough so that day guy loses his job and then night guy has no money to go out anymore, right? And he's, of course, being funny, but it's the same idea here that we're finding in the brain, that Emily Pronin is finding in the way that people describe things, which is that there can feel like a separation, an emotional separation of selves over time. Okay. The question is, why is that important? Why is that remotely important? The reason it's important for decision-making and for behavioral science intervention has to do with the way that we treat other people in our lives. So if you think about it, most of us, I would say, are probably kind people. We're nice people, but we're also self-interested. So if a total stranger came up to us and asked us to help them move, or to, like if one of your coworkers asked you to like suddenly take on a project of theirs and you don't know them at all, like you would probably like not be so like magnanimous and be like, sure, you would just go about your day. If our future selves are a little bit like that, like if our future selves are kind of like those strangers, the coworker we barely know, our neighbor who we don't interact with all that often, then we're not going to be all that prone to doing things for their benefit. It's almost more rational to do whatever we want today, to like eat less healthy, to not go on the run, to stay up later, whatever it is. The catch here is that our future selves, or rather, there are other people in our lives who we do make sacrifices for, right? So in other words, like I make sacrifices for my kids. We make them for our best friends. I'm sure we all have a coworker who we like really do like, and if they came up to us and they were like, please help me with my work, you would figure out a way to help them. And so if our future selves are like that, if they are like the coworker who we really love, or our kids, or somebody in our life who we have a sense of responsibility for, then we'll be more likely to do things for their benefit today. So over the years, that's one of the questions that my research has been trying to investigate. In other words, it's not a problem that our future selves look like other people. What's a problem is when those other people feel emotionally distant from us, when we don't have a sense of connection to them. What that means then is that what matters for decisions is not the otherness of our future selves. And I'm sorry to be too philosophical here, but what matters is the relationship that we have with our future selves. If we think of them like somebody who we feel a sense of connection to, someone we care about and feel a sense of responsibility toward, then we will do more things for their benefit. All right, so what to do about it? Let me talk about some of the solutions on a really high level, and then we'll sort of break and I can open it up for questions. So the way that I've thought about it, there's three classes or three categories of solutions that we can try to implement when it comes to making life better for our future selves. So one of them is to try to make the future self closer emotionally to who we are now, which is easier said than done. But if you want to get right down to it, one way to do that is to steal a page from charities. Charities do this all the time. If they want to get you to donate, they make charity recipients more vivid. We all know, if you've never heard of scope and sensitivity, it's the idea that we ignore stats about thousands of people who are in need, but pay attention to the one story. This is like the identifiable victim effect, right? And the same may be said for our future selves. Rather than paint an abstract picture of the future, if we can just make the future more vivid, that may make it easier for us to do things for those future selves. So one example of this, write a letter to your future self and have the future self write a letter back. In other words, we get people to step into the shoes of their future selves. I should also say, Allison, I'll be happy to share this afterwards. I have a like a worksheet that I've worked on with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that has a bunch of exercises in there meant to help educators and trainers get people to feel more connected to their future self. So I can share that later afterwards. That's free, I should say. So one option, make the future self closer by making it more vivid. We can do that through letter writing. We can do it through AI and visualizations and whatnot. Okay. Another sort of strategy is to start with the recognition that our current selves are the ones who make plans for our future selves. Our future selves want to look back and say, I did the thing you wanted me to do. I went on the run. I didn't stay up late, or I didn't snack, or whatever. And then there's the version of me in the middle that's going to mess things up, right? The guy who like will snack tonight, the guy who will stay up late, and the guy who will sleep in tomorrow morning. And so here's where I think the power of commitment devices really come in. Commitment devices have been around forever, and I think a lot of people have talked about them. But the idea of a commitment device is that we put guardrails on our behavior to constrain ourselves to do more of the things that we say we want to do. Now, in my research, the way I've thought about it is that there's different sort of categories of commitment devices, which I'm happy to elaborate on later. But one of the ones that I love the most is what we call, sort of contractual commitment devices, or ones where there's a punishment, where I would say, okay, I'm going to run 5 days a week, and I'm going to tell Allison that I'm going to do that. And she's going to call me on Sunday, and I'll tell her if I ran or not. Now, there's a soft version of that, which is that I just feel embarrassed if I said no, or if I didn't do it. And the sort of more extreme version is that I've given Allison my credit card, and I've told her, Allison, if I don't run 5 days, like, take $200 from my credit card and put it toward, how do I say, a political campaign that I don't want to donate to. I'll keep it neutral and say a re-elect campaign. Okay, that covers both parties in the US. Okay, but I think we can guess what I'm talking about. Okay, of course, stick.com with 2Ks sets up these contracts through the lens of current and future selves. What's interesting here is that the current self must pick a commitment device that's strong enough to deter behavior, but not so strong as to make us not want to sign up for something, right? And so this is a something that I'm working on right now with two of my collaborators, Craig Fox and Megan Weber, where we're trying to figure out what are the sort of antecedents that need to be put into place. What are the features of commitment devices? This is Megan's dissertation, to make them more likely to be adopted, because they're incredibly powerful and they're not adopted that often. Okay, the final category of solutions starts with the realization that if we think of trade-offs over time as just that, if we think of them as trade-offs, if we think of them as sacrifices today for benefits tomorrow, The person who is always making the sacrifice is the present self. The person who always benefits or gets punished is the future self. And this is sort of a terrible relationship. It's like if you were in a romantic relationship and you're the one who is always buying the gifts and always sacrificing and always putting your needs aside, all of your friends would tell you, get out of that relationship. It's not good. But we can't say that for our future selves. And I mean, there's this, what's Groucho Marx quote where he says, what have future generations ever done for us? And to apply that to our future selves, right? So rather than sort of bemoan this, or rather than say that's not fair, one other strategy is to try to dial down the pain on the sacrifices that our current self is making. So my favorite recent example of this from my own research is a collaboration I did with Shlomo Benartzi and Steve Shu, where we worked, this was with a fintech company, and we got savers who were signing up for a savings account. We asked them if they wanted to sign up for an automatic savings account. And I'm oversimplifying here, and I'm happy to talk about the details, but for some of them, we said, do you want to save $150 a month automatically? And others, we said, do you want to save $5 a day, which are the same amount of money, of course. I think everybody, regardless of the time zone, I think we can figure that one out. 7% of people sign up when it's $150 a month, which you could say is actually really large, but these are like warm leads. These are people who all sign up for a savings app. 4 times as many people, so 30% sign up when it's framed as $5 a day, in part because that feels like a much easier sacrifice to make. So one thing that I would sort of push back to the behavioral science community is, what are the other ways that we can dial down the pain on sacrifices today? And I'm happy to talk more about that. I think there's like a lot of different possibilities there, but the general idea is to try to make those present day sacrifices feel easier. Okay. That's the sort of like gist of this. Now, one thing is I did say, I started by talking about this guy, Greg, with the tattoo. And in working on this research and in thinking about, what was going to go into the book, I had this like bee in my bonnet that I really wanted to go talk to him. And so I was searching for him and trying to find him and ask him about this tattoo. And at the same time, I was also trying to talk to other people. And I ended up talking to this other thinker in San Francisco, this guy named BJ Miller, who's a palliative care doctor. It turns out I was trying to think about what are the most serious long-term decisions we can make. This felt like a category where it was really relevant. And this doctor, BJ Miller, is really trying to change the way that Americans at least think about the way that we die. I think he's trying to do this around the world, but particularly in America. And I asked him, when do plans go right? One of these long-term plans go right. And he said, let me answer it a different way. I'll tell you when plans go wrong. And his answer sort of surprised me because I thought he was going to say, oh, it's when we don't plan, or when we plan on a surface level way. And he said, our plans go wrong when people make a plan, but then they're too rigid. And they fail to recognize that their preferences may change as time goes by, and suddenly they're left with things that look differently, and they say, oh no, like stuff isn't the way that I wanted it to be. And he said things go right, especially in the end of life planning space, when people hold what he calls a mature view of time. When they plan, but recognize that their preferences and values can change as the years tick by, and then they can change their plans as well. And so I was talking to him, and I get this message back from Greg, the guy with the tattoo, and I was like, this is so fortuitous. And they're both up in San Francisco, and I end up talking to Greg, and my first question was like, how many tattoos do you have? Because I thought, oh, if this guy gets that tattoo, he's got to have like 1 million now. And he said, I have 1 tattoo. It's the one of the restaurant. And I was like, do you regret it? And it turns out the restaurant closed. And like a Greek restaurant opened in its space, and he's not a fan of Greek food. And so I was like, do you regret this? And he had this great answer for me. And he was an incredibly nice guy, really thoughtful. And he said, I don't regret it for an instant. And okay, and I was like, all right, tell me why. And he said, I'm in my 50s now. I was in my 20s then. And he said, my life is so different. I'm in the corporate world. I don't stay up all night. I don't go around eating burritos one day a week. And he says, but every time I look in the mirror at that tattoo, I'm like instantly transported back to the person I was. And the way he described it to me is that he knows that some of his preferences have changed, but some of him has sort of remained the same. And he hinted at the idea that that will be true moving from the present to the future as well. So I think, you sort of couple that with what the palliative care doctor was saying. And I think one of the final sort of strategies, and this relates very much back to what Allison was talking about with sort of these plans where we say yes, and then later on we say, damn it. Part of what this relates back to is the idea that one of the best things we can do for our future selves is recognize that our preferences have changed from the past to the present, but that they will also continue to change from the present to the future. And that if we treat our future selves like the way that we treat our loved ones, knowing that they will change over time, that's when I think we'll be happier with the plans that we make and not necessarily regret them later. Okay, so let me stop there and open it up. I know that Merle was going to take over and open it up for questions, but I'm happy to sort of answer anything you guys want to talk about here. Thank you for your attention thus far.
Thank you so much, Hal. That was absolutely amazing. I do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I will get through them, but very selfishly. I will ask the very first question because I love this example so much of Craig getting tattooed. And, he just looks back on and saying, like, I was a different person back then. I have different preferences now, but I like being mentally transported back into who I was then, as a sort of like a fond reminder, see how far I've come, and what have you. But to me, Allison's example reads incredibly differently. Well, Allison's example of your article reads very differently, where there is a person making these future commitments to running, knowing damn well that right now they want to be a person who runs, but they know they are not a person who runs. Like, they have absolutely not gone through that mental, physical, spiritual journey of becoming that kind of person. So is this a commitment contract to get your future self where you want to go? And is this something that people genuinely think works?
Right. No, this is a great question. So, it turns out what we know from the literature on commitment devices is that stronger ones with punishments, and ones with social accountability work better. So there's an analysis of the commitment devices from stick.com. And if people don't know it, stick.com with 2 Ks, I assume a lot of people know that in this world, but if you don't know it, it's a space where you can make commitments. The ones where people follow through are the ones that have a punishment attached. Now, for some people, signing up for a run where I pay money to do it, that's a bit of a punishment, right? Because if I don't do it, I've paid money to not do something, and if I do it, well, what's nice about that is that I've now forced myself to go through with the thing. Now, this is obviously a nuanced example, and there's idiosyncrasies because, certainly anecdotally, we talk to some people who say, I did it. I thought I was a runner. I'm just not a runner. I learned something about myself. Great. Okay.
Sure.
But there's another version of this, which is that I think the way that you described it, Merle, is exactly right. This is a form of a commitment device. So there are cases where I say yes to an obligation, and I later regret them. Those cases are not the things that I think of as commitment devices. Those are the things where someone asks us to do something at work, a presentation, travel for a conference, something like that in 4 months, right? Or a friend asks us to help them out with something in a couple of months or a couple of weeks. We look at our calendars, it looks wide open, and we say, why not? I'm free, right? Sure. That's not a commitment. That's, I think there are cases there where we are unfairly treating our future selves because we're signing them up for something that they're not going to want to do, especially if we're not going to want to do it right now. Does that distinction make sense?
Yes, it does. Okay. Absolutely does.
Great.
I have a sort of statement which can be turned into a question because I think the evidence on this goes a bit back and forth from Kate W. So she says, I've always heard if you can define it, so like a SMART goal, I suppose, SMART being the acronym, and share that commitment with others, which holds one accountable, then it's more likely to become a reality, almost like a user proposition for yourself. But I thought the evidence on committing to others or sharing such a goal or a commitment, that's not always the best way forward, as in outsourcing it sometimes backfires. Can you shed a bit more light on that?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So, I mean, and this is what economists have called a soft commitment. Because, you know, there's the only thing that we lose from not following through is like maybe some self-respect. Because now we've turned into people who are inconsistent. And I think most of us, you know, consistency is wrapped up in self-esteem. We want to feel better about ourselves. We want to know that we're consistent. This kind of circles back to what I was saying earlier, which is that if you look at the different types of commitments, the ones that are strongest are the ones where there is that contract or that punishment in there. That said, in this work that my student Megan is doing for her dissertation, one of the things that we are finding out, and again, this is with Craig Fox as well, one of the things we're finding out is that there's a lot of things that I think people think we know about commitment devices, and the evidence is not necessarily there. So we're in the process of trying to sort of organize this literature, because I think these are both interesting and practically useful tools for the behavioral science community, and it would be great to know more about the nuances.
Absolutely. Well, keep us posted on that research.
Yes.
Very keen to hear it. Also, guys, I can see around the participants that some of you have your hands raised. Do me a favor, just drop your question in the chat. I know there's quite a few questions in the chat. I am making my way through them. I promise.
I'll be quick with the answers.
No, don't, please. So another thing that you mentioned, so obviously in the example of your article that Alison mentioned, I think the person signed up for the marathon or the run about 3 months in advance. Very clearly, they had no desire to do it. But does the length of time between your current self and the future self matter? Does it make much of a difference in terms of rewards, costs, discounting, and whether you can prepare yourself for the marathon that is to come?
No, this is a great question. So in theory, yes, because, you know, the sort of theoretical basis for this work is that with more and more temporal distance, there's less and less of a connection to our future selves. It's, you know, that future self becomes more and more of a distant stranger the further out I go. Empirically, I'm not sure that I can answer that one with data, because what we don't have is like enough studies that vary the time length of present and future selves, and then vary the sort of the rewards. We do know some, you know, there's some research from Dan Bartels at Chicago that looks at the length of time as and relates that to discounting, where you do see, you know, the further out, the more we discount future rewards. But I think your question is even more nuanced than that, and it's actually ripe for empirical investigation. It's a great one.
All right. Well, if someone here in the chat wants to do a PhD or another PhD on this topic, give us a shout. So this question is a bit very much self versus culture. So how can we use non-self-centric, so more geocentric culture like holistic systems thinking that has principles to be less Western, less narrow-minded, and more synergetic with the system that we need to adapt to? So is there a way of committing to not just idealistic humans, but the whole environment that we interact with, regardless of the political system and the individual struggles? I'm not familiar with this work. It looks like you are, so that's good.
This is a nice, easy one. I'm sure we can wrap this up in 25 seconds or so. No, I'm kidding. So, you know, I think there's a couple things to note here. One is that I'll try to make this quick, but I think this could be the type of thing that would be better to talk about offline. Look, there's a narrow sort of individualistic view in Western culture. And if we were to sort of expand these theories out, you know, worldwide or to Eastern culture or cultures that are more interdependent, if you will, there's some questions about whether or not you would see some of these same relationships. Another thing to note here is that sometimes when we say, you know, have the individual do more to eat healthy or to save or whatnot, it puts the onus of responsibility on the individual, when in fact we could argue, and tell me, you know, if I'm not getting the question, then I apologize. We could argue that we could create better environments to foster it, you know, to foster easier decisions among individuals, right? Like in the US, one of the things we talk about is healthy eating. You talk about food deserts, where people live in communities that aren't near grocery stores with healthy, fresh food, right? And so that then it becomes a lot harder to say eat healthier. Well, I can't find where to go. Let me say, like, that's something I'm happy to talk more at length about afterwards, because I know there's other questions too.
All right, you might be able to get back to it. So a question from Elan. Sorry guys if the name pronunciation is completely off. It sounds like it sounds like this theory is connected to the experiencing self versus the remembering self that Kahneman also talks about. I'm wondering how that theory contrasts with the future and current self that you've just addressed.
Yeah. So, one way to think about this is that all these theories stem from this idea of multiple self models, right? That there's different selves over time. Experiencing versus remembering self, of course, is talking about the difference between how we experience something versus what the construction in memory is about that thing, about that experience, right? And how those two can be contrasted, right? Now, of course, that could connect to some of the things like, when someone gets a tattoo now, how do they feel about it later? There's an experience from versus remembering self there. So much of my work, though, is more about the sort of perspective nature of this, perspective nature of planning, which is that we have the version of us now and the version of us later who will either benefit from or suffer from the decisions that we're making right now. So I think they're cousins, if you will, but they're still a little different.
There is a question a bit later, which is now moving up. So that's literally straight after, but it ties in really nicely. So this question is from Cassie. So it's very easy for us to agree that we are very different people now to who we were 10 to 20 to 30 years ago. But do you think that we actually overestimate how similar we will be in, say, the same 10, 20 to 30 years to who we are now? And I'd actually like to tag on to that question, because what you've just mentioned, like, we have the benefit, if you will, of being able to remember what we were like. However, that is, of course, tainted by the view that we have now. We have a tattoo from 20 years ago. So as a result, are we still the kind of people who like tattoos? Like, you do have a basis to stem from. Obviously, with the future self, that is not so much true. How does that interplay?
Yeah, so the recommendation I have here is to look at, there's a wonderful paper by Jordi Quadbach, Dan Gilbert, and Tim Wilson called The End of History Illusion. And this is a paper from, might be 10 years ago, it was actually in Science. And what they find there is that across the lifespan, people recognize that they've changed from the past to the present. So exactly what Cassie is saying here. But then, and this is exactly your intuition, people overestimate how similar their preferences today will be toward their future self later, in 10 years time, 20 years time, whatever it is. What's interesting about this to me is that it flies in the face of the data. The data suggests that regardless of where you are in lifespan, you will change in those 10-year periods. But we have this sort of illusion that somehow the person we are right now is the fully baked version of us. And that, sure, we'll change a little bit, but I think the quote from the paper is that the rate of progress will slow somehow as the years move by. And the danger here is that it makes us prone to treating our future selves unfairly. This is, again, where we end up sort of committing ourselves to plans in the long term, possibly, and not revisiting them because we think, oh, that version of me will be the same. That is who I am right now. So I would encourage you to look at that paper because it's incredibly well written and fascinating. It does a great job of explaining that exact idea there.
All right. So because you've just mentioned the commitments, I'm going to jump one question ahead. Don't worry, Marina, your question will also be addressed, but this one's by Michelle. So how do you recognize if your current goals and commitments for yourself are actually outdated? So more based on past self than for your current self or your short-term future self, if you will. If you don't actually understand where you are in your self space, and is there such a thing for you to understand as the self-development space, really?
Yeah, it is a fantastic question. I mean, I'm just gonna have to speculate here because we don't have, I wish there was like empirical work that would say, like, how do you check this? One thing I would say is my speculation is that most people don't regularly do this sort of exercise to even ask themselves if those past self plans are outdated, right? But we know that we are creatures of, or rather that we succumb to inertia. And what that means is that we often just continue doing the things that we've been doing because we're doing them. And I think this question really highlights the idea that like if you're already at the stage where you're asking whether or not your past selves plans are outdated, my guess is that you're far and away above the above the norm there. And I guess another way to think about this is the same way that we approach investments, which is one way to grapple with the sunk cost bias is to say, would I invest in this thing right now? So rather than say I'm doing this just because it was already there, you might say, this plan that I have, if I were to start this right now, would I adopt this plan or would I not? And if the answer is no, then that might suggest it's outdated.
So are you warning us against making 1 year, 5 years, and 10-year plans just to be safe?
And I don't think there's any problem with doing that as long as you revisit them, right?
Okay, fair enough.
I say this knowing that I canceled a call with my financial advisor last week because I knew I needed to update stuff on our life insurance plan and I didn't feel like doing it.
Okay, fair enough. Well, that's do keep up with your own finances because the market moves very rapidly these days. Of course, depending on what you're doing. To actually get back to a question by Marina. So how can sacrificing be made easier for the present self, given that it's mainly the present self doing the sacrificing, as you've mentioned, in this very toxic relationship that we seem to be in?
So one of the strategies is what we call temporal reframing. This is what I was talking about earlier, where we take something larger and break it down to smaller chunks. New research led by I forget, Marissa Sharif and Katie Milkman are on it, and I'm so sorry I'm blanking on the first author, has found that this same strategy works for volunteering as well. So if you want to get people to volunteer more hours, don't ask them to do 10 hours a month, ask them to do a couple hours a week, and adjust, right? There's a lot of work that needs to be done there because there's calibration that matters there, right? This is also a space where it makes sense to try to figure out if we can buffer any sort of painful sacrifices with positive feelings or positive experiences right now. Of course, again, I'm going to mention Katie Milkman's temptation bundling is a great idea here, where we sort of pair the negative with the positive. My colleague at UCLA, Ali Lieberman, has work on what she calls tangential immersion. And the basic idea there is that we have to think carefully about matching how engaging the tempting activity is with the more painful one. And so temptation bundling is really good to get people to sign up to do something. But tangential immersion is the idea that while I'm needing to brush my teeth, say, for 2 minutes, I may have an easier time maintaining that activity if I couple it with something that's engaging, but not too engaging. Because if I suddenly decide to watch like a really intense thriller, I might stop brushing my teeth. That's way more engaging than the activity of this. So it's got to be just kind of right, which is going to be nuanced there. Anyway, those are just a couple of the things, but I'm happy to chat more about that afterwards too.
Amazing. I now have a flashback to when I myself was listening to really heavy techno whilst brushing my teeth. And trust me, it is not an experience you want in your life. It doesn't end particularly well. So this is so to focus on more of this connecting with our future selves. You've already mentioned there are a couple of ways of doing it. For example, writing your future self a letter and then having the future self write back. Vishal is actually asking, is there a way of connecting with our future selves that make use more of meditation and other ancient practices and or rituals that you are aware of?
So not that have been studied empirically. Anecdotally, I've heard of people using what they call the empty chair technique or the 2 chairs technique, where you basically sit across the table from an empty chair and you have a conversation toward your future self, and then you switch chairs and now you talk back. Now, that's not meditation or sort of an ancient practice, but that's another sort of technique. I would be very interested to see, what sort of things Vishal's talking about there, because I think there's lots of different possibilities that we could imagine working there. I would say on a non-empirical but just commercial level, I know that Prudential at one point hired a hypnotist to get people to sort of become hypnotized into thinking that they were their future selves and like what it was like to live that way, which feels like an extreme version of meditation, which is obviously more self-directed, right? But Yeah, I would love to think about that more. It's a really interesting question.
Okay, in that case, Vishal, do put that down in the chat with like a bit more examples of what this could look like. So Hal has something slightly more concrete to work with, and we can take it from there. Question from Damien. If the current self builds self-efficacy through achieving goals, does the memory of experiencing that achievement empower the future self to achieve that goal again? So even if they lapse for a couple of years.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't have a great answer. I mean, it certainly, I mean, that would, if you think about Bandora's work, that certainly would make sense. Of course, we would want to hold that memory close and make sure, now we get into sort of the complicated nature of like the version of me who did that was now my past self. And we would want to make sure that I feel identified with them still so that I can, sort of conjure that image. It makes sense to me, but I don't know of any research that sort of directly addresses that question.
I guess there is a way of reframing that question, especially because they also mention lapsing. So when we let's assume that we've got a memory that spans about like a serious amount of decades, say like 30 to 50 years of memory that we can work with. And as a result, throughout, we have been able to make progress towards certain goals, then we've had these lapses. So within memory, from a motivational perspective, if you will, do the successes weigh heavier than the failures, or do you think the opposite is hold true?
That's a great question. Of course, one of the things we know about memory is that the negative fades over time faster than the negative fades over time faster than the positive does, right? So that would suggest that maybe we might hold on to the successes more than the failures. There's also, other research by Ann Wilson and Mike Ross that suggest that we sort of can like differentially like connect to our past selves, right? So if it's a past self who achieved something, we feel very close to them and we bring them in. We're sort of like have pride in them. But if it's a past self who did something embarrassing or failed, then we're quick to say that's not me. I am different now, right? So again, I think that does sort of speak to the idea that here's a case where maybe the successes are going to be more salient than the failures. Now, but then of course, then you can flip that around and say, well, what about regret? Because of course, regret is all about those negative things, right? But that can also power us, to use that word, that can also empower us to change our behavior so that we don't make those mistakes again. So the short answer is that it's really nuanced and complicated.
Yes. I think Damien's second question, you have essentially answered, as we did link this to empowering the self to push through current goals. I would like to extend that question a bit on what you just mentioned. So I'm not massively aware of research on memory, I'm afraid. So I didn't know that the negative is more likely to fade quicker. Because doesn't that seem to be a bit more counterintuitive to how averse we are to losses? And like, if we are so averse to something and something is so salient to us, why would that fade quicker? I thought that would just stick around forever.
I think that's not what I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that's what the cognitive psych literature shows. So in fact, and there's a new paper that just came out looking at, why is it that we well, anyway, maybe this is a bit of a tangent here. We can follow up about that, but I could be wrong about that, but that's not my memory. That's not my memory of the the cognitive psych literature.
Fair enough. Something for me to dive into over the weekend. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, one question from Alex. So, great discussion. Thanks. Not sure. Compliment for you, Hal. As humans, do we always see our future self state as better than our current self state? Is it innately human to be on a journey to getting better?
It's a great question. Dan Bartels and Sarah Maluki have some research suggesting that we incorporate the idea of positive change into, it's like almost like a given. Like we assume that I will continue to be who I am, even if I'm getting better over time, because that's the trajectory that we like. Of course, there's also narrative psychology research that suggests that, we love narratives that have this sort of redemption and like positive change or positive growth in them over time. the caveat to this, of course, is, if we think about specific periods of time, right? And the basis of ageism, of course, is that we think the future will be worse in some ways, right? So now we start getting into the different domains, right, where I may think I will be wiser over time, but physically be impaired, and so on, right? So it's not easy to say it is just one thing that we're always getting better in the future. In many ways, I think that's true, but in the certain sort of nuanced way of thinking about aging, I don't know that that's always the case.
So you mentioned the example of end of life care, and of course there is, and I think this is known to many behavioral science, that it is almost impossible to get people to think of the negative aspects of the future state, which might be, and will very likely for most, if not all people, include dying. But it's incredibly difficult to get people to make a will, for example. Given all the research that you've done, how would you go about solving something as practical as that?
I'm in the midst of trying to think about this right now. This is really like at the center of my future research directions. And one of the things that I'm finding out is that I think behavioral science oftentimes can offer simpler or easy to implement solutions for big problems. But there may also be certain problems that are so multiply determined and almost so complicated that we have to look beyond the sort of like simpler solutions, right? And so I started a project with two of my now former students where we were trying to just test out messages to see if people were more interested in advanced directives. And that's not a will, but it's also end of life planning. And we this is all online with just hypotheticals, and we could not move the needle. And it was interesting because we're saying all these things that theoretically should work are just not working here. And we sort of stopped for a bit because we realized maybe this is a space where people don't want a quick message, but this is where the conversations have to happen. Now, my current thinking on this is that, and this kind of goes back to one of the questions about sort of Western, Dimitar's question, right? Sorry if hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. This may be a case where it's not about the self, but about the impact on others. One of the things we know from the literature on grieving is that grieving is much more positive when our loved one's end of life was not tortured. And so if you think about one of the benefits possibly of writing a will and having an advanced directive and an end of life plan is that now I've removed a lot of the uncertainty for my loved ones. Could that be a motivator? I suppose you have to like your family and your loved ones for that to work. Any case, that's where I would go with that.
Okay, so rather than future self, which in death may no longer be so relevant, as harsh as that sounds, an other focused future perspective. Okay, love that. Thank you very much. This is going to be the very last one, and then we're definitely going to be at time. So this is coming back to the meditation-oriented practices that Vishal mentioned earlier. So an example of this would be a loving kindness meditation practice. So that would be with starting with wishing well for ourselves and extending the same love outwards. And that is a way that can help us to connect with our friends, neighbors, and even our enemies. So, we're doing real good here. I wonder how that might be adopted to get our present selves to stop eating an almond croissant that in Vishal's case is happening as we speak. Not entirely sure why he is so hell-bent on stop eating almond croissants, but here we are.
Well, I think when we talk about intractable problems, almond croissants are one of the most intractable, right? I have never been able to stop eating those. So Vishal, I have no solution here. But in all seriousness, I think I love that idea. That, I know that you're joking a little bit here, but I think there is something to be said for that. I think that could be a really interesting way to sort of have a deeper connection with the future self. The empirical question that I would want to follow that up with is, what sort of outcomes would that be most effective at impacting, right? Because loving kindness meditation, this sort of thing feels so macro and so big picture that I'm not sure if I would be able to then like take that and then like the next time I'm tempted with my kids' candy that's up in the pantry? Like, will I conjure that up? Or is that the type of thing that would be incredibly useful to impact some sort of bigger decision? You know, if I'm thinking about making a career change, if I'm thinking about signing up to work with a nutritionist, or signing up to change my portfolio, or whatever it might be, you know, I wonder if a big intervention like that would work better with the bigger sort of outcomes. I know that we're running out of time. Before people go, I want to just thank you for these incredible questions. This has been great.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions and your great interaction. Obviously, thank you so much, Hal, for making the time. This is an absolutely fascinating topic. I love the formatting. I see so many slide decks all day. This was actually very refreshing to just have someone talk to us with such expertise about the work that you've been doing. As was mentioned before, Hal has written a book about this, and of course his stories will be explained, and his research and the stories surrounding his research will be explained in much more detail in that book. So Alison already mentioned you can get it apparently via Booktopia. Otherwise, I think the Australian version is supposed to launch on the 12th of September. So fingers crossed. And your future self in about 12 days from now should still have a similar enough preference set as to also want to engage with that book and engage with Hal's amazing work. Hal, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. For everyone on this chat, there will be another behavioral science meetup in about a month from now. As always, last Wednesday of the month. And given the enthusiasm, that we might actually consider also having this during the lunch break, because it does seem to work for a majority of you. As always, guys, it was an absolute pleasure. Hope to see you next month. Hiya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.